My guest this week is John Staddon. He is the James B. Duke Professor of Psychology and Professor of Biology Emeritus at Duke University and the author of the new book, Science in an Age of Unreason. And in this interview, we talk about the book and how the way we're approaching science now is hurting both the industry and the country at large. John, welcome to the show.
Well, happy to be here, Charles.
Well, I was excited when I got a copy of your book, Science in an Age of Unreason, which we are definitely living in, and was excited to talk to you about it. And you make some really interesting points in the book. So first, I think I may know because of the nature of what we're living in, but why did you write the book?
Well, I'd been writing essays over the years on various problems that I saw with science. I mean, I'm an experimental psychologist, psychobiologist, and I saw a lot of stuff that simply was not true. Some of these crises are well recognized. There's something called the replication crisis, for example. A very brilliant chap called John Ioannidis in 2005 wrote a paper with a wonderful title, Why Most Published Findings Are False. That's a pretty daring title to put in an academic paper, I think you can imagine. But he was right. And the reason was that the standard method that's used in social science and in biomedical science turns out to have massive flaws in it. And that was very interesting. And it was recognized to some extent. People tried to do things about it and so on. But the method still goes on. And I was interested to understand the reasons why it was so popular, even though it was obviously defective. I could go on in some detail about it. I'll say one thing so people understand the method. The idea is that if you want to understand the effect of, let's say, a drug, you can't compare an individual with and without the drug. You have to compare people who have the drug versus people who do not. And one of these is called a control group. That gets a placebo. The other group's an experimental group. It gets the drug. And then you compare those two using statistics. But the statistics depend on a model, which turns out to be defective in all sorts of ways. So that was one entree into this whole thing for me. That's one reason I got interested in it. There are other related reasons. I could go into those.
One thing that's interesting about the book, because I saw the title and I'm like, this is going to be interesting. This guy is going to write a book talking about how we're in trouble, both from a standpoint of taking bad directions because of ill-advised findings, or the social science garbage where they're talking about, race and gender and things in a really unscientific way, which you do cover. That's what I'm thinking when I open the book. But you right out of the gate brought up something that is interesting, and we may have to have another conversation separately because I've been kicking this around in my head, and you might be the person to ask. But you talk about secular humanists, and you talk about faith and separating science from that, and how a lot of people get a pass because their approach as atheists or as hard scientists who are just following the facts, quote unquote, and they have no other influences, are not actually doing this in the way that science should be approached, right? They do have, their preferences, their leanings, and in some ways they are approaching things in a religious fashion, but they get a pass because they're opening their label is leading with the fact that I'm not religious, right? But the way they approach things are very similar to those who have religious faith and are following things from that standpoint. So talk about why you included that, why you opened with that, or why you think that's important.
Well, it started with a blog post on Quillette where I said something which I thought was pretty obvious, which is that there are different aspects to religion. There's the spiritual aspect, the belief in God, the divinity of Christ, and so on. These things are not they're not things that can be proved by science. And I think almost all scientists would agree with that. You can't prove that God exists or doesn't exist. That's one part of religion. But there's another part which is to do with its moral guidance, the Ten Commandments, the Golden Rule, and so on. These also can't be proved by religion, but they affect behavior. They affect behavior in a way that belief in spiritual things does not. It doesn't really matter whether you believe in transubstantiation or the divinity of Christ. That doesn't affect your behavior directly. It's just a belief. But the Ten Commandments do. They are guidance for behavior. My point was that secular humanism has two flaws, really. One is it thinks that the facts of science are a guide to behavior. Well, they're not by themselves. In and of themselves, they're no guide to behavior. This was pointed out 300 years ago by David Hume, a wonderful Scottish philosopher of the Enlightenment. The facts by themselves don't guide behavior. They have to be combined with beliefs. And these beliefs are matters of faith. They're not things that can be proved by science, okay? But that's what I claimed in this little article, which I expanded in the book. But my innocent blog elicited very violent reaction from a distinguished evolutionary biologist. He said, no, this is absolute nonsense. This is the worst paper ever published in Quillette. Of course, science tells you what to do. And it does so only because the values of the secular humanists are concealed. They're not written down like the Ten Commandments. There's no creed that you can consult to create or to criticize. So in a way, they have achieved a position of being above the fray by a kind of stealth, because they do have beliefs, but they're not written down in any way. So this led me to work this up into a chapter for the book and to point out something which I think most thoughtful philosophers would absolutely agree on. Facts by themselves don't guide you. Science is like a map, but the map doesn't tell you where to go. It tells you how to get there. You have to have a destination. So science is a map. It's not a destination. The destination is provided by faith, by beliefs that are unprovable by science. So that was the theme of my essay.
Okay, I want to say one more thing, and then go on to other things, because I could easily have a whole interview just about that, because it was fascinating. So I do want to quickly point out the ways in which you explain what you're saying in the book that were interesting. So you give some examples, because I have a lot of conversations with people who have this belief, right? And so not in an aggressive way, just questions. So how do we get this? How do people be good? How do we know what good is? That kind of thing. And they'll say, well, it's easy. You don't need any set of standards. You don't need a 10 commandments. You don't need a guide. You just, do what's best for society. Right. And then you did the wonderful thing of saying, well, who decides what's best for society? Right. Because there's too many factors in there to say what's best for society. So you give several examples there. And I think it was really great that you added that, and really interesting to point out things like, should we be giving the vaccination for COVID to the elderly and not younger people? Should we be, there are social norms that we do that technically aren't best for society if we're trying to do what's best for the most people. So talk about that briefly.
Yeah, well, the COVID example is a good one. If you, like I think my colleague, believe that evolution gives you a set of values, that's probably the most popular and most plausible way to deduce values from science. Obviously, something which furthers society, makes a given society more likely to succeed, to persist into future generations. That's obviously the best thing. Well, in the COVID case, that would mean if there's a shortage of COVID vaccines, it would mean not giving them to old people and people with comorbidities, because obviously those people, from an evolutionary point of view, are less fit than the younger, healthy people. But I think most people, and certainly most Christians, would say, no, we should help the most vulnerable first. So this is an obvious case where a sort of superficial evolutionary analysis gives you a set of values which are absolutely antithetical to what most decent people would believe. And there are many, many other examples like this to do with gender and so on and so on. But that, I think, is perhaps the most dramatic one.
Coming up, more with John Staddon, professor of psychology and professor of biology emeritus at Duke University, and the author of Science in an Age of Unreason. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
We return to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer. Once again, here's Charles Love.
Are you tired of summer nights in Maine?
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with John Staddon, the James B. Duke Professor of Psychology and Professor of Biology Emeritus at Duke University and the author of Science in an Age of Unreason. And in this segment, we talk about Darwin and how he's misunderstood by both his critics and those who support his theory. We talk about faith and its importance and how it's overlooked in science, and the problem of too many scientists. So your book is split up into 5 parts. The second part being the profession, the third part being climate change, the social science, history of science. But before I get into some of the other ones, the last thing I want to say about the first part is you have a couple chapters talking about Darwin, which kind of leads from the secular humanist to the natural selection and evolution. And you ask, was he wrong? Which is not what you really say. It's just a question. But you make an interesting point of saying that the problem with those who overemphasize the importance of, or I won't say importance, but that Darwin was right, focus more on the selection and kind of ignore variation. So talk about why that's important.
Well, the sort of what one might call a radical Darwinists, like Richard Dawkins, for example, they argue that the variation from which selection selects is small and random. And indeed, if that were the case, then selection is doing most of the work, because the variations in all directions, it's very small in extent and so on. The point I make is if you actually look at variation, it's not small, and it's probably not random. I mean, and this is back to Darwin. Darwin didn't know about genetics, right? His genetics came after he had departed. From a genetic point of view, variation is usually small, but it's not completely random. There are things, something called hitchhiking, where one gene rides along with another and so on. So it's not a completely random process. But selection doesn't operate on genes. It operates on what's called the phenotype. It operates on the whole organism, okay? So what we're interested in is the variation from one generation to another, one organism, set of parents to offspring. Is that variation small and random? And the answer is it obviously is not. If you look at deviations from the norm in the offspring of different species and so on, well, you get, for example, snakes with 2 heads. You don't get a snake with half a head, okay? The variation is not random. The variation is not small at the phenotypic level. And it probably isn't random either. There's a wonderful set of studies in Africa between the different lakes. There are all these lakes in Central Africa which are unconnected with one another. And yet they have evolved species of fish which look very, very similar from one lake to another, even though they have completely different genotypes. So it looks like if you run the tape of evolution twice, you will get not something completely different from one run to another, but very similar results. And whether these whether these similarities are sort of preordained, is there an aim or purpose to evolution? We don't know that. But we do know it's not random and small. It's not random and small. And so there may be more structure to it than extreme Darwinists believe. But Darwin himself did not believe. He was well aware that there were big changes from one generation to another. He drew attention to what he called sports in plants, for example. It's in some ways easier to observe in plants. It's easier to observe in species that evolve a lot faster than we do. We have to wait a long time from one generation to another to see the changes. But in animal species, or plant species, you can see these much faster. So that's the conclusion. If we look at evolution, the structure of it, the direction of it, is determined in many ways much more by variation than by the selection that operates on them.
And so to the second part, which was, just as fascinating, you talk about the profession. And I've had several conversations about these problems. But one thing that you talk about that I had not really broached is the problem of too many scientists. So talk about the change in the number of scientists and how that has affected the way science is viewed and carried out.
Well, it's a complicated question. One problem, there are too many scientists in the sense that they can't get the kind of jobs they used to get 30 or 40 years ago. I mean, when I was graduating back in prehistory, you came out of graduate school and you pretty much immediately got a tenure-track job, okay, a job that promised permanence in whatever university you went to. Now that's unheard of, essentially. A guy or a lady who graduates now, her first job is going to be a postdoctoral fellowship. She's going to be a postdoc. She'll work in a lab, probably a big lab. She'll probably be little more than a technician, the work that she's offered. And it probably won't be the first postdoc she'll have. If she's ever going to make it into academe, she'll have to go through 2, 3, 4, even 5 of these postdocs. So in that sense, there are too many scientists to be employed. The other sort of variable to consider is how many solvable problems are there in any area of science. Now, there's a very famous report by Vannevar Bush just right after the Second World War, which set off the governmental scientific revolution. It was called Science, the Endless Frontier. Well, yeah, it is endless in the sense that there are always problems to solve. But it may also be the case, and I simply raise this as a possibility, that the number of problems is not infinite at any given time. There are only a certain number of things, given the techniques we have, the existing body of knowledge and so on, only a certain number of problems that can actually be solved. But the number of scientists is predicated on the belief of this Vannevar Bush report that there are an infinite number of problems. So you double the number of scientists, you double the amount of progress. But science is not like widgets. If you've got a factory, if you double the number of machines and workers, you can double the number of widgets. But science really isn't like that. First of all, it's an elite profession. And not everybody wants to be a scientist or is capable of being one. It's very, very difficult, particularly the social sciences. The problems are almost impossible to solve. So looking at things from that point of view, it does seem likely that there's a superfluity of scientists. Now, what's happened? Well, what's happened in social science, I think, contributes to the problem. It helps the unemployment problem of social scientists by giving them problems that appear to be solvable but are not, and so on. I'll give a little history here. In Britain, at the end of the 19th century, there's an organization called the British Association, which is an association for all of science. And they had half a dozen divisions, chemistry, physics. There was an engineering division, I think, at that time and so on, but a very small number of divisions to cover all of science. Now, there are more than 100 divisions. Well, you might say science is complicated, you have to have specialists and so on. The problem is that if you look at what social scientists do, they're basically almost all of them studying the same thing, which is human behavior in a social context. But by having, let's say, 54 divisions in the American Psychological Association or 53 in the American Sociological Association, what you have is a bunch of bubbles, a series of bubbles within which criticism is very much limited. The criticism is limited to those people in that little subdivision. That's very bad, because what's involved is something which looks like a science. They publish papers, they have reviews and so on. Peer review system exists, but the peer review is a very tiny selection of the people who should be critiquing that work. So you get these deviations from one division to another. You get concepts that are studied that have no validity, but everybody in that group agrees on it. So it looks like science, but it isn't really science, because the criticism is limited. The language evolves into an impenetrable jargon, which is understood only by the people in that little subdivision. So it veers off and off and off into something which is not anything like science. And you have a constant... You have concepts that arise out of this which are not testable in absolute basis of science. And the definition of science is your ideas are testable. If they are not, they're not science.
Coming up, more with John Staddon, professor of psychology and professor of biology emeritus at Duke University, and the author of Science in an Age of Unreason. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with John Staddon, the James B. Duke Professor of Psychology and Professor of Biology Emeritus at Duke University, and the author of Science in an Age of Unreason. And in this segment, we talk about the profession, the problems with scientific organizations and universities and scientists being anti-science, not being able to replicate results and things of that nature, the problem with scientific publications, and the problem surrounding peer review.
To go back a little bit to the replication crisis, why is it that this NHST method, hypothesis testing statistical method, why is it so successful? Well, the reason is, it's like a one-armed bandit. If you apply this method frequently enough, even if what you're studying is non-existent, you will get a statistically significant result 5% of the time, 1 in 20. So it guarantees the product that the modern scientific system demands. Science used to be a vocation. The people who did it, like Darwin, Faraday, and so on, these guys had more or less independent means. They could follow their own desires without any problem. They could fail. That's the big thing. Science is mostly failure. It's a trial and error system. The trials are based on existing knowledge and hunches, basically. And a lot of those hunches will fail. And it's not an accident that Charles Darwin, he discovered natural selection in 1837. He didn't publish anything until 1859. Why did Darwin wait 20 years, and how could he wait 20 years? He waited 20 years to amass a huge body of evidence in support of his idea. He knew that it was controversial. He knew that it was a tricky notion to comprehend. So he wrote copious notes over 20 years before he published. And he wouldn't have even published but for Alfred Russel Wallace scooping him on it. That would be literally impossible now. There's no way a scientist could wait for 20 years before publishing his chief finding. That means instead of publications representing really well-established facts, they wind up being little partial, unreplicable fragments. The point is, basing evaluation of scientists not on the truth that they come up with, but with the publications they come up with. We have created a system like social science that evolves to produce publications, but not to produce truth. And some of the papers which are still most frequently cited turn out to be frauds. I mean, even after they're frauds, they're still cited.
Isn't that part of the problem with the peer review, in that it's a self-fulfilling cycle? So they say, well, this stuff must be right because look at how many times they're being cited. But everybody just cites the same thing. But people just tend to think it's true really quickly. And I had a back and forth with someone. We were talking about the race thing, which we'll get into. And they said something insane. I'm like, that makes no sense. And they say, well, the American Psychological Association said racial trauma and social justice is this, that, and the other. They're an important institution and organization. So if they say it, they would know. How can I listen to you, who's just a layman, when this important organization is saying that all Blacks are suffering trauma?
Well, I'm afraid all the professional associations have adopted explicitly a social justice ethic. Now, you can be for or against social justice. I think most people are for it, but it's got nothing to do with science. It's a kind of religion. It's not anything to do with science, and science should not be corrupted by it. But there are statements, I've commented on some of them, by the APA, the American Psychological Association, American Medical Association, that really subvert their true purpose, which is to support science, biomedical science, and so on. It's a terrible thing. And I'll say one thing about peer review. Peer review has two or three functions now, as it functions now. The paper goes to two or three reviewers. The editor sends it to two or three reviewers. They don't have time to look at the original data. They're not paid. They don't have time to do it, and often they don't have access to the original data. They can find simple mistakes. It's not clear. You did your statistics in the wrong in some obvious way, and so on. So that's one function, to find small mistakes. The other function, which is implicit in it, is censorship. In other words, quite honestly, from their own basis, everybody has biases and so on, they may find flaws in a paper. Now, the editor's job is to arbitrate this in some way. But the editor is particularly in prestigious journals like Nature and Science, the editor is confronted with the task not of approving, but of disapproving. He's got to get rid of papers. He can't publish but one or two of 1,000 submissions, let's say. So any negative comment gives him what he wants, which is the ability to dismiss a paper. So peer review, in fact, peer review combined with an oversupply of papers acts as much as a censor as something which validates the work. It's unavoidable. It's not that people are evil. It's just demand or supply much exceeds demand for these papers. And it's just an inevitable result.
Coming up, more with John Staddon, professor of psychology and professor of biology emeritus at Duke University and author of Science in an Age of Unreason. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with John Staddon, the James B. Duke Professor of Psychology and Professor of Biology Emeritus at Duke University and the author of Science in an Age of Unreason. And here, John talks about how the effects of all this is really hurting science and finding solutions because you can't critique the work that they do. You can't replicate it. You're told to shut up if you dissent. And they're using pseudoscience to fit their beliefs instead of following the truth.
I think the problem is a system problem in the sense that most scientists are very well-intentioned. They are following the rules and so on. The problem is that the rules are wrong. I mean, that's one difficulty. That's one problem. Another problem is a kind of defensiveness, which means that critics are attacked. I try to give an example. Suppose you encounter somebody, you a scientist or just a citizen, encounter somebody who says, well, I really, really think the Earth is flat. Can you explain to me why you think it's round? Well, I think most scientists would say, well, some people have measured it. There's an old experiment by Wallace, actually, he measured the curvature of the Earth on a long canal. He had a level, and he went down and found that the surface was not completely flat. Well, what about the horizon? If you go high up on a cliff, you can see a ship just on the horizon. If you go down lower, you can't see the ship. Doesn't that tell you that the Earth is curved and so on? You can go through arguments like this. It would be a perfectly civil discussion, right? But if you approach a climate scientist and say, well, can you explain to me why you think the temperature is going to rise in this precipitate way and why you think carbon dioxide is the sort of tuning knob that turns out the climate of the Earth, they will, generally speaking, be very resistant. I had that experience apropos of the chapters in the book. A friend of mine, Peter Morecambe, who's a physicist and an engineer very interested in this problem, I wasn't particularly interested. I had noticed a terrible defensiveness on the part of climate scientists, and this was, I'm not the first to notice. Many more eminent people than I made the same comment, most particularly Freeman Dyson, who's a wonderful physicist at Princeton Institute for Advanced Study, brilliant guy, made all sorts of contributions. And he made the same comment years ago that the climate scientists were very defensive. They didn't want to explain exactly how it worked and so on and so on. And we had the same reaction. Peter nagged me into collaborating with him, and we came up with a paper. And we sent a draft of this paper to 3 climate scientists. 2 of them we knew. They were very eminent. They were probably sympathetic. They wrote back and said, great, they didn't make any detailed comments, which is, we wanted detailed comments. The third person was a colleague in the environmental department at Duke. I'd sat on committees with him. We had perfectly amicable relations. But when he got this paper, he wrote a rather hostile email saying, well, you're not climate scientists, stay in your lane. That's anti-science, it's just crazy. I guess his thinking was that climate science is so intricate and so complicated that even though both Peter and I were fairly well-trained scientists, we were incapable of understanding. That was his feeling about it. I could have reminded him, I didn't, that even the most complicated science can be explained in a way that's understandable by a reasonably well-educated person. The example I would have given is a wonderful little book called QED. I don't know if you've heard of it. You should read it if you haven't. By Richard Feynman. Richard Feynman is one of the great scientists of the 20th century, a physicist. And he explained something called quantum electrodynamics. That's a hell of a lot more complicated than climate science in my mind. At least it's harder to understand. But he wrote a little book that he explained it. You can read the first chapter and you understand where it's going. You understand the thing. And we want to do the same thing for climate science.
But isn't this part of the problem? It's not just that they're defensive. There's things you can't say. So, okay, climate science is too hard for even regular science to get. It's too intricate. But how about when you just say that putting in effort and working hard and hours of study and the ability to read will increase opportunity in X. It's not racism. That gets a challenge, right? It's not just it gets challenged like, well, I don't want to explain why that won't work. You get shut down. You're not allowed to say it. They want you fired from your job. So it's things like that. And the bigger problem is for you, you're right, it's bad because it's anti-science. But it's also a problem of, I like to give them the argument. You want to improve the condition of poor people and specifically poor Black people. How are you going to do it when I'm not allowed to say, hey, I get that you're poor and I get that a guy used to, whites used to do these things to Blacks on a regular basis 80, 90 years ago. But I still think if you study and you read enough, you could probably just shut up. You can't say that. So that's even a problem because you're hurting the people you claim you want to help.
Oh, that's a horrible, horrible problem. And social sciences contributed to it by coming up with ideas like white fragility and systemic racism. I mean, years ago, when I first encountered the notion of systemic racism, I thought, well, how do you measure it? If it's scientific, you've got to have a way to measure it. Otherwise, it's just a phantom. Well, it's slavery, as you said. It's the usual. It's slavery. Well, slavery was 150 years ago, ended then. The problems with the poor Black community, my reading of it, and you probably know a lot more about it than I do, but my reading is that they have actually gotten worse. The disparities have gotten worse since the Civil Rights Act of 1964, not better. Well, if the cause is that far in the past, you'd expect them to get better with time, not worse, right? I mean, if you treat people like victims, you remove their agency, you remove the incentive for them to do something better for themselves and their children. It's a terribly, terribly destructive thing to do.
Coming up, my final segment with John Staddon, author of Science in an Age of Unreason. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back. I've reached my final segment with John Staddon, the James B. Duke Professor of Psychology and Professor of Biology Emeritus at Duke University and the author of Science in an Age of Unreason. And here I ask him, what do we do? How do we push back against this when they're being unreasonable, when scientists are using their credentials and their labs and all their resources to push racism, racist studies, and skewing the social sciences to make matters worse?
Well, the problem with notions like systemic or structural racism is it blocks attention to the things we can actually measure and actually do something about. And the emotion comes in immediately. I recount, an example in the book, in the book when a college magazine, somebody writes a letter and says, well, lack of two-parent families, lack of books, and so on, may have something to do with these racial disparities. The reaction of the Black Student Association at Duke was, this is racist. This is racist. In other words, the guy was simply pointing at factual things that could be studied, and he's called a racist. And that is so destructive. It's destructive to science, is even more destructive to society, as you point out. So one thing we can do is criticize, point to people who make this. I'll give you a very recent example. I mistakenly sent an article that was intended for Nature magazine, a critique of their position, which is all into the systemic racism idea, to Science. And I was responded to by Holden Thorpe, who is the editor of Science, a very eminent scientist, okay? And he said, it was such a pompous statement, something like, we regard criticisms of systemic racism as misinformation. We regard, I mean, it was unbelievable. It was so sort of smug and condescending. Well, you, just a poor idiot out there in the boonies, we know that this is just disinformation. The evidence is overwhelming, he said. Didn't give me the evidence, right? Didn't give me the evidence. But that was his feeling. And Science magazine is committed to this idea. Nature magazine is committed to it. All of the major scientific associations are committed to it. I mean, it's become, as my friend Gad Saad says, like a virus. He has a book called The Parasitic Mind, which lists all of these kinds of things. And it's almost like a virus that infects all of these people, and they can't see anything else. They can't. And again, back to a core theme of my book, which I really want to emphasize, they can't separate fact from passion. They cannot separate fact from passion. And if you can't do that, you can't study anything. I mean, science becomes a nonsense. There's certain things you can't say, like the example I gave you. I'm sure you have many other examples. And that is a poisonous failure. I'm not sure what to do about it except to say as loudly as we can, stating a fact should never be penalized. You criticize it by all means, but you can't. Your response to a fact should never be to tell someone to shut up, which is really what we have now.
Well, I think that's a great way to end it. He is John Staddon, Professor of Psychology and Biology at Duke University and author of the new book, Science in an Age of Unreason. John, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Charles. Appreciate it.